Today we're continuing Science Month by diving into all things space law. Dr Imogen Saunders is standing by to give us the brief on this very crucial part of the forthcoming missions to the Moon, Mars and beyond.
Now, in its 7th year of podcasting, Trekzone presents a Trekzone conversation with your host, Matt Miller.
Well, I'm now joined by Dr Imogen Saunders, an expert on space law. Imogen, thanks so much for a little bit of your time today.
My pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about space law.
Well,
such a broad-ranging question, but where do we begin?
It absolutely is. Space law is fascinating, especially at the moment, because space is governed by a series of treaties that were created and signed over 50 years ago. And so the world that these treaties were created in, space exploration looked very different than it does today. And so we're now looking at a new dawn of space, a new reality for the use of space, and we have a legal framework which might not be quite equipped to handle it.
It's an interesting dilemma, I guess, because, as you say, when it was developed and space exploration was very much done by the governments, and those governments were the US and Russia. There was no sort of militarization of space or permanent habitation sort of on the horizon, or even private companies sending tourists into space.
Absolutely. So the current regime is really based on the assumption that it will be government agencies that are exploring space. And as we know today, government agencies are certainly still involved in space, but we also have a lot of private actors. And the treaty framework doesn't necessarily deal with that reality.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What are some of the challenges that the treaties could be faced with?
So one of the big things is actually the use of space resources. And space resources, what I'm talking about essentially is asteroid mining. Now, this is something that hasn't occurred on commercial scale yet, but it probably isn't too long until it becomes feasible. And the question is, who owns these resources? Can a private company make private profit from minerals or metals that they get from an asteroid? Or are these resources something that should belong to the whole of humanity? The treaties seem to suggest that space should be treated a bit like areas on Earth that are called the common heritage of mankind. So I'm talking here about the deep seabed, for example. But the treaties are not conclusive on that. And we have at least two countries, the United States and Luxembourg, who have now passed national laws allowing their citizens to make private profits from resources gained in space.
It's very interesting that it's Luxembourg.
Yeah, absolutely. The United States makes a lot of sense. Luxembourg a bit less so. But Luxembourg is really trying to position itself as a centre for space exploration. And as well as passing these laws, it's also entered into agreements with other countries, including Japan and Portugal, and it's currently talking to Russia about a bilateral agreement about space resources.
It's really funny too, because when we sort of talk about mining asteroids and the resources that, I mean, they're so rich in resources, it's almost like a lot of things that are in the headlines of science and space news at the moment. It all was the realm of science fiction not a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is fantastical, futuristic imaginings in some way, but on the other hand, it's also potentially very, very profitable. And so because of that, you're seeing a lot of money and a lot of research, a lot of resources put into making this reality. Well,
some of the space law that is being tried at the moment, or at least tested at the moment, there's one particular case that Brad and I covered on a recent Talking Science in regards to an astronaut that was allegedly, or has been accused of allegedly using space station computers to access her husband's or her ex-husband's financial records.
This is actually not too much of a hard question for space law, just because of the particular situation on the International Space Station, in that all the countries who have contributed to the International Space Station have signed an agreement that essentially says whatever part that they have contributed is treated as their own territory. So in this case, it was a United States astronaut. She accessed a computer in the United States section of the ISS. And so because of this agreement between the states, it's actually treated no differently than if she'd actually done it on Earth in the United States.
And one analogy that I guess Brad and I were sort of likening to is a little bit like embassies on Earth. So if it's at the US embassy here in Canberra, is that sort of the same sort of jurisdiction? It falls under American purview.
Exactly. But the reason that happens is because the countries involved agreed that it would. So it's very similar to embassies in that embassies exist because the hosting country agrees that the country coming in can essentially treat the embassy ground as their own territory. And the ISS agreement works the same way, that each of the countries that contribute agreed that their part would be their own territory. Where it would get more complicated is if something like this occurred in a situation where perhaps it wasn't a governmental space station, but you had a vessel or some kind of station that had been built by a private company. And so you didn't have an agreement between governments that they would treat that vessel as territory. And then the legal issue as to where this crime actually occurred would become a lot more interesting.
Another interesting facet has been President Trump's calls for his Space Force. I think he's been watching too many movies, but but it does it flies in the face of this exploration treaty from all those years ago, doesn't it?
It does. And that's one thing that the Outer Space Treaty is really firm on, is that space must be used for peaceful means. And so any idea that you would have a Space Force, there's a quote from President Trump that says, "It's not enough to have American presence in space, we must have American dominance in space." And this idea that any one country would use military might to dominate space is completely against the legal framework. The question then becomes, what can we do about it? With international law, if there is a breach, the only option really is to either exert diplomatic pressure on a country or to try and challenge that country before the International Court of Justice. But the United States doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. So if they went ahead and did this, there is a question as to what countries could actually do legally in response to it.
I guess the conspiracy theorists out there would say that, or would find it hard to believe that some level of militarization of space hasn't occurred already. So, and obviously, surely, I mean, GPS was originally a US military invention. So, is it those sort of things as well that have sort of become? I guess GPS has become such a big part of civilian life. But yeah, military satellites and those sort of things, specifically for the purpose of military use. Do they sort of fall in? Or?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's two parts of that. The first is it is without question that space is currently being used for surveillance for military purposes. And we've seen that recently in China. We've seen that in the South China Sea with photos of the artificial island building that China's undertaking. We've seen that with countries tracking the movement of military vehicles in other countries. So that's the first step, is that is happening. And many, many countries have satellites that they use for military observation and surveillance. But the second thing to say is that countries are also testing weapons in space now. And the most recent public test was done by India when they shot up what's called a kill missile to deliberately impact on and destroy one of their own satellites in orbit.
It's kind of taking it to the next level.
It absolutely is. And, and India publicly announced that they'd done this on Twitter, complete with a photo of the missile launching up. Now, at this point, they were attacking their own satellite, so it wasn't a question of taking out another country's asset, but the capability is there, and India is by far not the only country with that capability. And, of course, the other problem that results from impacting satellites in orbit is the creation of space debris, because once these satellites are destroyed, they leave behind a cloud of debris, which then causes possible dangers for other satellites or indeed other vehicles.
And I guess a big question would be if that debris impacted on someone else's, so maybe it is a cleaning up a dead satellite or something like that, but that debris then floats into the orbit of another country's satellite and causes significant damage. I guess it comes down to who's paying for that repair.
Exactly. who's responsible for that damage. Absolutely.
It is an absolutely fascinating topic, Imogen, and there are so many things to think about that I guess people in the general public aren't even aware that these sort of things need a conversation. But then when you talk about it, it's sort of like, well, it does make sense. We need to know who's responsible and who's going to do things before we need to actually put it into practice.
Absolutely, and what people are allowed to do in space. So not only who's responsible for when something goes wrong, but what are the limits as to what can be done in space and what shouldn't be done in space. And of course, what we're talking about here aren't just legal questions, but also issues of potentially dire consequences if something goes wrong. If you're mining on an asteroid and alter its orbit, you could have catastrophic consequences. So these are things that the legal framework needs to be in place before we start seeing the realities occur.
And then I guess the hypothetical question would be, what happens if an advanced alien species comes along and claims the asteroid belt anyway?
Well, that is a question that international law is probably not equipped to answer. Would have to turn to intergalactic law instead.
Fantastic, Imogen. Well, I appreciate the bite-sized look at space law. Such a complex topic, but I think we've got an overview of what it is and where we need to get to before we probably make it to Mars in the next 5 years.
Absolutely.